One of the beauties of the New Testament, the beauties of our new covenant, is that you're not required to work your way out of, to salvation, out of sin. You're given that, and you can't earn it. But at the same time, you don't want to forget then that, so I can't earn it, and we all sin, so we just keep sinning. Because Paul quickly even addressed that in his letter to the Romans that says, so we just sin, so grace abounds. I mean, no way. So you can kind of break this chapter into multiple parts. Verse 1 through 13 of Daniel 2 is the king has a dream and then gives an unreasonable challenge to the wise men. Then there's Daniel's initial response to the king's challenge. How did Daniel handle such a drastic thing? There's Daniel's request of his friends. What did Daniel do with respect to his friends when this challenge happened? Then God answers the prayer in the verses 19 and 20. And then there's a praise to God. There should always be, when answers a prayer, a praise to God for answer to prayer. And then we'll end the lesson with a little bit about, we'll do it as we go, but we'll particularly kind of tie it all together at the end with how you can apply the lessons that we've learned to our own lives here and now. So, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. So what happened with this dream? We're going to read the dream in a moment, but in general, we're going to talk quickly about the king had a dream that troubled him. He wanted to understand its meaning. He also wanted to test his wise men. So apparently the king was a little uncertain whether these people were as wise as they said they were. And he's like, I'm asking them questions and they're my counsel, but do they really know what they're talking about? Or they just make stuff up? And so he challenged them, and his challenge was brutal. I mean, it was incredibly brutal. So without further ado, I've asked Stacy to start out by reading Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 17, and we'll hear what's going on.
In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of his magician or enchanters or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
And I left out the last one. I'll say, he urged them to plead for mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men. So, have you ever woke up in a bad mood? Would you say Nebuchadnezzar woke up pretty troubled and in a bad mood? And obviously, I don't know that any of us have ever felt like we were going to, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to kill you all. But that's what he said. Stacy, Richard has his hand up. I know you're handing out, which I appreciate.
Well, to me, it's that king did not trust these guys that well because, first of all, that was smart on his part to say, tell me what the dream was and then interpret it. Then I'll know that you know what you're talking about, in other words, instead of me telling you the dream and then you interpret it the way you want to interpret it and I got to believe you. So he had them boxed.
Well, knowing the rest of the story, we know that there was a time a little later in Daniel, the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar actually lost it completely and started eating grass and living in the woods and sleeping on the ground. So, obviously he wasn't completely stable, but it does sound like he was ready to replace all his astrologers and wise men because, I think in a logical sense, if he were to be thinking logically, he would know that no one could do what he was asking. So, he really put everybody in an extremely difficult situation. And another really odd thing to me, it's kind of funny to think about is, if you've assembled all the wise men in the country and now you're going to kill them all, what are you going to lay left with in your country when you're done? You just want a bunch of guys that aren't, a bunch of people that aren't very smart. So, it didn't make a lot of logical sense what was going on here, but we might find that there was more going on behind the scenes than we know, that there was a higher power that was controlling what was going on, and he was just another pawn. But he appears to be the guy really in charge right now. So the first thing I want to talk about as far as applying the lesson so far to us is, when you face a crisis, a personal crisis, a pandemic, whatever crisis that we all, face from time to time, how do we respond? When you're facing a serious crisis or problem, what do you usually do first? Anybody got any ideas? What's that? Pray. So obviously prayer is the right answer sitting here in this room right now. And I pray that no matter 24/7, 365, no matter when something like this happens, the first thing you do is pray. However, are there other things that people tend to do? Okay, so Daryl's adding work hard to the praying. In other words, you think God expects you to do your part.
You got to work.
God expects you to do your part. It's an old adage that I'll tell it quickly, but I always loved the idea that a guy's having a flood and it's come up to his house and they send a car by on the road that it's almost submerged and he says, God's going to save me. And then it gets up and he goes to the second story of his house as the flood rises and they bring a boat along and he says, that's okay, God's going to save me. And finally gets on his roof and they bring a helicopter and he goes, no, God's going to save me. And then when he dies and drowns and he gets to heaven, he says, God, why didn't you save me? He said, I sent you a car, a boat, and a plane. I tried, but you didn't do your part. So that's I think what Daryl's saying. Well, under the age of 30 at least, maybe even under the age of 50 now, but what's one of the first things I see young people doing when they face a problem that's maybe more of a world problem, not a spiritual problem, is they Google it. My son had a problem with his septic tank when he had just gotten his first house and he and his wife were still early on in their careers. And he called and said, what do I do? And I said, call us expert and they'll fix it for you. And next thing I know, he tells me he Googled it. He dug up what was his septic tank entry point. He flushed it out himself and he fixed his problem by Googling it. And now almost everything that these, if I don't know how some electronic thing works, I'll ask one of my son-in-laws and the next thing you know, they've YouTubed it or Googled it and fixed it. So, Google has become an answer to a lot of our problems, but not our spiritual problems, obviously. Well, another thing that people do oftentimes is they find an expert with experience in solving the problem. Is that a good idea? Yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with finding an expert that's got experience with the problem, but that should be your first thing. That may be what you do after you do what you should do first. And then some people talk to close friends and family. Now that sounds like an excellent idea. You know, young ladies who have their first child, they oftentimes have mothers and grandmothers and aunts that can tell them, you know, oh my goodness, this is going on. Yeah, that happened to me. Let me tell you how I handled that. You know, guys have the similar issue with their dads sometimes and other people they trust. So, you know, close friends and family can give you advice. But oftentimes, you know, if you have a really serious problem, a medical issue, you know, a crisis, something else, you know, talking to experts, talking to your family and friends, Googling it aren't going to help, because it's really not where you should go first. So they become anxious, and they seek medical attention, and they want something for their anxiety, and they want something for their anxiousness, and they need treatment to help them through what's going on. And even to the point sometimes that people just get frozen. They just sit down and say, all is lost. And sure enough, I think if, you know, we were faced with what Daniel's faced with right here, you know, we might well get pretty anxious. We might well, I'm not saying he didn't, but we might well have all sorts of things that we would do prior to doing what we should do first. And we're going to briefly go over what he did. But if somebody has Daniel, I didn't ask anybody else to do that, but if you can find Daniel chapter 2, starting with 19, and read down through 23 now. Stacy will bring in the mic if someone wants to read that for us. Eric, you have that? So let's find out what happened. Or Stacy? Yeah, it's actually up there too if you want to read it. Yeah, go ahead, Stacy. Read it off the screen. Good eyes.
During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven, praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and disposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what was asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king."
All right, so now we're kind of already gotten somewhat to the bottom line of what happened here, but let's go back to our original question and say, you know, what's the first thing we would do? And then now, what did Daniel do? Because there's so much wisdom in these stories that can be applied to everyday life now. So upon learning the king's order, Daniel takes action. Darrell said, you know, you're expected to do something. You're not just supposed to do, you know, I'm going to pray and sit here and wait on God to save me. You know, you should pray to God, but also you should take action and do something, and not do something crazy, do something calm and cool. So I think it's very interesting that it says that with wisdom and tact, Daniel asked the king's guard for an explanation. You know, we don't see too much wisdom and tact among most people that are protesting, among most people that are disagreeing these days. And, you know, I'm not at the risk of causing political issues, and I don't mean this, but, you know, whether it's a school board or fill in the blank today, you know, there's not much wisdom and tact, and there's not much respect going on when we have controversies or problems in our community. And you know, whether it's the news media or whether it's advocacy groups or whatever, they're constantly throwing gasoline on the fire and trying to stir things up and say, you know, you should react violently to this thing. You should react in a very negative way to these things. But that typically doesn't get you anywhere. You know, I used to laughingly as a sports fanatic say, you know, when someone screams at the referee, I'm not sure what they're trying to get, because, all the referee has to do is an old thing, throw another flag and walk 15 yards away and say, how do I smell from here? If you don't like what I just did, you want to call me that again? We'll go back further. So at the end of the day, screaming at a judge, screaming at a referee, screaming at a king or a king's person, why are you killing all of us, probably wasn't going to get him anywhere. So his wisdom was that he wanted an explanation, get the facts. You can't handle it. And I love to tell the story that there was a time with one of my children early on in my parenting where they came home and told me a story about what happened at school, and they got in trouble. And I got indignant of the way my child was treated. So I marched up to the school to talk to them about what happened. But fortunately, when I got there, I said, tell me what happened. And once I heard the other side of the story, the rest of the story, I calmed down real quick before I opened my mouth. Because, there was a lot more to the story than my child. I have a boy and 2 girls, and so I'm not going to say because I don't give it away, but what my child had told me versus what actually happened. And even then, sometimes, they can be a little defensive themselves. And, I like to say there's constantly 3 truths in most things. There's, this story, and the actual truth, which is often in between, and that's why we have trials and theoretically can get more justice. We let both sides tell their story, and then some relatively unbiased observers decide what makes the most sense. And usually they get it right, but sometimes they don't. So then he went to the king. So, my understanding of this day and time, you didn't go to the king lightly because, you were risking off with his head right now. But, he used wisdom and tact, and he impressed the guard enough that the guard went back to the king. He got before the king, and he said, give me a little bit of time, just a little bit of time. You've given all these other wise people, astrologers. I'm not sure wisdom and astrology are in the same. But anyway, if you love astrology, I apologize if I offended. But anyway, he asked for a little time, and the king must have been impressed with the way he asked his questions and the way he presented himself, probably pretty humbly. So he asked for time. He took time. Then he went to his friends. The importance of having friends and having the right kinds of friends. He went to his friends, and, they were wise. He didn't say to them, hey, guys, we're the wisest people in this whole country. Let's figure this out. Let's see if we can come up with an idea to explain the dream, and maybe we know enough about him, we can figure out what, get some context clues. No, he went to his friends and said, pray to God. Pray to God for mercy. Let's pray about this. Let's give this a little time before we make a quick decision about what's going to happen. And then he went and prayed himself. He went that night, and he went and prayed about it. And once he got the answer, he gave God all the glory. We're going to see in a moment as we read, if somebody wants to, if they're not already there, or you can read it off the screen if you got really good eyes. But we're going to go to the next little bit of scripture. So let's see what happens now that he's gotten the answer and he's given God the praise. Eric, you got this one? Okay.
Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?
Actually, go ahead if you don't mind, since you're doing such a good job, and read on through. Let's see. Let's go. Wow. If you want to, read all the way through to the end of the chapter, to 48.
Okay. And go.
I need to go to the next slide for you. I got it here. No.
All right. Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people, whoopsie daisies, so something happened to the people.
Oh, I hit it?
So the people will be mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Okay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court.
So he was just a really smart guy, and he just kind of used context clues and figured this all out himself, right? You know, if the king had just said, guess what I'm thinking, there's some pretty wise people that know people really well that might be able to say, oh, you're thinking about this, or you're thinking about that. But this is kind of blow you away stuff. I mean, he's telling him exactly what he dreamed and then went on to prophesy what's going to happen next. But he told him exactly what he dreamed. And that had to be mind-boggling and really humbling as a guy who, can do whatever he wants and says, kill everybody. I don't like them. To see that somebody actually has not just read a little bit and predicted. These wise guys probably, if you remember when they left Egypt, that when Moses was doing some things, they they were able to throw a stick on the ground and turn it into a snake, at least an optical illusion, like a magician that you might see on a show or something. They were able to do some of the things that Moses did to begin with. And likewise, they didn't go through a number of plagues and things to get to where they needed to be. This was a one big step. But, those guys, if he had just said, tell me what I'm thinking, or tell me in general, give me an idea of what I dreamed and I'll believe you, whatever else you say. But he gave him in intimate detail exactly what he had dreamed. That had to be something else. Something else. And obviously Nebuchadnezzar was blown away. Obviously he couldn't imagine what happened. Now, what we just read, the second half of the chapter, we're going to briefly overview for today's lesson, but we're going to dive deeper into the prophecy and the what happened in the future. We'll talk about it in general today, and then Monty will dive further into that next week. I think Ron Moore was asking, are we going to get into comparing what happens in Daniel to Revelations? And, the second half of Revelations of Daniel is, in fact, similar in many ways to the second or two-thirds of the book of Revelation. But absolutely, at this point, there is something that's predicted here that hasn't happened yet. And, with the first half of the story being told exactly like it happened, when there's no way he could have known that, the astrologers were right when they told the king, nobody but the gods they weren't right about the gods, but they knew that nobody but a god could know what you dreamed. But then he realized that they're right. And Daniel didn't take credit for this. He gave all the credit to God. He said, I'm not wise. I was just told, like you got the dream first, I was just told that. So Daniel describes the image that's depicted as 4 kingdoms that will rise and fall. He told him that the first one was him. It was Babylon. So at the time, and from 605 BC to 539 BC, Babylon ruled the world that was known at that time over there. And so he said, you are the first part of this. And then he says, just a moment here. The super bright lights really don't make it easy for a teacher to see what's on the screen up there, because we have it behind us, so I have it here. With Babylon as a starting point, now you get into the prediction of the future, and he said the chest and arms of silver were the Medo-Persian Empire, which we know during Daniel, not long after this happened, Darius the Mede and the Persian Empire took over. So they were in charge from 539 BC to 333 BC. Then the Greeks overthrew the Persians, and so the Greek Empire was the belly and thighs of bronze from 333 to 129. And then finally, the mixture of clay and iron was the Roman Empire, which represented the legs of iron and the feet mixed with iron and clay, and that was from 129 BC to 565 AD. So they were there for a long time. But they thought they were still in charge after 30 AD. But there was a little thing that was mentioned, a big thing that was mentioned in this prophecy about something that was cut out not with human hands, that actually established a kingdom that was going to be a kingdom forever, and that was going to, over time, crush that Roman Empire as well. And sure enough, it finally inverted. God said, enough of this. They tried putting church with politics and said, if we can't control these Christians who we're constantly killing, let's make it an official religion, and then we can control it. And then it became not what the church and what Christianity should be. It became an arm of the government to control the people. And so that's for another day. So Christendom became the official religion under Constantine, but again, that was not what he did, was not what God ultimately was talking about as his kingdom that Jesus established. So Daniel's revelations. Daniel revealed, as he was explaining everything to the king, he gave God the credit for the dream and its interpretation. So again, he said, It's not me. You're going to think I'm the wisest guy ever, that I have these special powers. But he said, I had a dream like you did. God gave you a dream. God gave me a dream. He pointed out that God's role in placing him king. So he said, this guy that gave you this dream and the guy that told me the answer to this dream is the guy that put you in charge. So you need to remember that if you're scared now by what I've just been able to tell you, you need to remember that you're only here because of the grace of God. You're only here for a purpose God has, and you better not forget that. You're not there because you're so smart, you're so tough, you're so, his dad had started it, and he had taken over when his dad died. And then Daniel does not honor himself, as we've kind of already talked about many times with this interpretation, but he says, it's all about God. And interestingly enough, if you read on through the rest of Nebuchadnezzar's time, though he had bad traits like all leaders do, and power corrupts completely, that he remembered and continued to remember that God was in charge. He had to be reminded a couple of more times in his the rest of his reign, but he acknowledged that this was the one and only true God.
Chris?
Yes.
That reminded me of something that I've seen so many times and probably been guilty of it myself, and that is that sometimes when we get into a crisis and we go to God in prayer, and through some sort of process, that crisis is averted and things get better, and our tendency then oftentimes is to say, well, look what I did. I fixed it. But Daniel said he immediately went to God and thanked him for what he had done. And I think sometimes we forget where some of that guidance comes from. We forget where those blessings come from, and we think we've kind of done it ourselves.
Yeah, I think a couple of weeks ago when I did the introduction, I talked quickly about, it's human nature to quickly forget our blessings. It's human nature to have long memories for things that happen that aren't blessings. And the next crisis comes along, and what have you done for me lately? And not remembering that and the big picture, this is relatively insignificant. So there's no doubt that we consistently are saying, we do that with our friends. What have you done for me lately? We do that with our family, if we're not careful. We do that with God, which is the worst time when you do that. So we have a really bad tendency, and the same thing goes for, we'll look at the hard work I put into it. When Daryl said you got to do your hard work, you can't think I'm going to do this hard work and work my way out of this. One of the beauties of the New Testament, the beauties of our new covenant, is that you can't, you're not required to work your way out of, to salvation, out of sin. You're given that, and you can't earn it. But at the same time, you don't want to forget then that, so I can't earn it, and we all sin, so we just keep sinning. Because Paul quickly even addressed that in his letter to the Romans that says, so we just sin, so grace abounds. I mean, no way, no how. And there's plenty of places and other places where God says you got to work. You got to do your part. You just don't get proud of what you've done. You don't get proud of doing your part. You always remember that God decided to bless you, that you're here for a reason, and if bad things happen, there's a reason. If good things happen, there's a reason. And it's not always true that bad things happen for what we interpret as a reason. Sometimes it's easy if somebody's really bad and something bad happens, you say, see, he got what he deserved. And, but that sets us up for saying, well, if bad things happen to good people, then why did that happen? That's not fair. But that's not the way life works, and the sooner we understand it, as Daniel was teaching Nebuchadnezzar here, the quicker we're going to be happy in life. Okay, Stacy Loopy wants to say something.
In that situation, a lot of times people will look at you and say, if you're a Christian, then why are you having such a hard time? That's not supposed to happen to you. Well, it says in the Bible, you will have trials and tribulations, right?
Of course, absolutely. And there's a lot of Christian preachers out there that preach a gospel of prosperity. If you give enough money, if you do enough of this or that, then, nothing but good things are going to happen to you.
Right.
And that sets people up. It sets people up to say, well, as long as he was blessing me, I was going to be worshiping him.
Right.
But how dare him do that to me or my family? That something like that should happen. I'm not going to worship a God that would allow that to happen, or this to happen. And that's why the Bible is so full of interesting facts about what has happened in the past. Because there's several things in the Bible. Now, I always laughingly say I'm sure this is not going to be really happen when I get there, but I always laughingly say I'm keeping a list of the things I want to ask God about. Why in the world did you let that happen? Why in the world did this happen? What do you really mean about that scripture? I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. You got to hate your family. You got to hate your mom and father. That it says it there in one of those verses, but you got to put it in context. And I always laughingly say I'm getting a long list. I have a feeling when I get there, I'm not going to care. I have a feeling it's not going to matter. Is that Jennifer? Yep. Hold on.
I have a friend right now who just lost their spouse to ALS 3 weeks ago. And I talked to her yesterday, and she was saying that she's never struggled with her faith so much. She's dealing with, the questions of why. And I really didn't know what to say to her, but I ended up saying, it's at times like this that we have to pull closer to God, because this is the perfect opportunity that the devil will take to try to break that bond and that relationship that we have with him. So despite, the stages you're going through, the anger and, all those things, you need to try to pull closer, because the devil will take this opportunity to tear you away from him. So, you can ask your questions, but just know that this is when you need to lean more onto God.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And, I think that's an excellent point, because you're not human if a horrible thing happens to you and you don't necessarily question a little bit why this happened, why did God let this happen, how unfair, ridiculous. I think, obviously we were given the stories of Job. And, it's easy to say, look how the story ended. But if you had been blessed like Job, he had everything you can imagine. And he loved God for it. And the devil said, God, that guy Job, he'll curse you if you let me do enough to him. No, he won't. So, he took all his earthly things away from him, destroyed all his holdings. They took his land. Then they killed his family. The devil allowed his kids to be killed and all of that. And then that wasn't bad enough. He got boils on his skin, and he got sickness and things. And as far as we know, Job had done nothing. Absolutely nothing to deserve it. And yet Job, as an idol for all of us, not an idol to worship, but as an example to all of us of how to respond when we don't think we've done anything wrong and yet horrible things happen. He's an excellent example of how we respond. And then you go to Christ. Christ, he wasn't questioning God in the garden, but he was distraught. And he was begging, let this pass for me if there's any other way to do this. I'm willing to die for everybody. I'm willing to die so that we all have the ability to have mercy and grace and forgiveness and propitiation, big word, access back to God. But he hadn't done anything. How is that fair? How does that make sense? So, it's not easy to sit here unless we've been through the same thing and tell somebody whose spouse just died of a horrible disease that we don't have any way of knowing, even at this point in the miracles of modern medicine, how it happens, nor how to fix it. Sometimes we know how it happens and can't fix it, and sometimes we don't know how it happens, but we figured out some way to make it better. But there's a lot of things in medicine that we still cannot fix. And, bad things happen consistently to good people. And there's a reason for it, just like this interpretation of a dream. But the reason is not always readily available to us, even in our lifetime. Sometimes in our lifetime it is. I've told this story before, but there's a lot of people that may be in here that haven't heard this story before, but there was a deacon at the previous church where I was that they were a member of Amway, a multi-level marketing thing, and they left their teenage daughter and their middle school-age son and their 2-year-old at the home to go to one of their events one night. And while the teenage daughter was cooking, the 2-year-old slipped out the house and got in their pond and drowned. And there was this immense outpouring of love from the church. And his mother and father, over the next 6 months, saw such a love outflowing that they got baptized. And then a few years later, they died. And this deacon would get up and give his testimony that I didn't understand what happened, but I would not have spent eternity with my mother and father and my daughter had this not happened. So in his mind, he saw a reason a few years later why he might have lost his daughter. Now, unfortunately, we won't necessarily all see that. We may not ever know until later why something happens. But sometimes you'll see an answer, but it's not going to happen right now. It's going to happen, a year from now, 5 years from now. Who knows? 3 months from now. So there's always a reason, but if we think we're like Peter and we're not going to deny you, I'll die first. Peter is an icon. I mean, he wrote some books in the Bible, and he's one lead apostle, and so he doubted, he failed, but he didn't lose his faith completely, and he ultimately succeeded and did very, very well. So that's a fantastic point, and all we can do to someone like that is love them to death and try to get them through it. But I pray, I'm not like Jesus, I guess, and I need to work harder at it, but I pray that nothing like that ever happens to me and my family. But if it does, I pray that I'm going to be able to get through it like Job did, get through it by using some biblical characters that had to go through similar things, knowing that there's going to be a reason, knowing that there's something some good that can come out of something that seemingly by our human wisdom makes absolutely no sense. All right, so what kind of life lessons do we learn from this particular Daniel episode that we're given? When we're faced with an impossible problem, and he was certainly, unless someone disagrees, he was faced with an impossible problem. He got the facts. So, when we are faced with an impossible problem, you might spend a brief bit of time in prayer, but, you might even have a better prayer later once you get the facts of what's going on. Buy some time. Don't act hastily. If there's one thing I've worked at for most of my adult life, it's not responding hastily. Whether it's something I say back or whether it's something I do that I later said, I think I should have spent a little more time praying about this. I think I should have spent a little more time getting more facts about this before I actually do it. In this digital world of being able to respond to things, I learned several years ago that when I'm really angry and I want to send an email back to somebody that's made me angry, I will write it and then I'll set it aside for a day. And usually when I read it the next day, I don't want to send that. What was I thinking? Yeah, and paraphrase that for Daryl. Am I admitting that I have said things I shouldn't say in a moment of anger? Have I in a moment of self-righteous behavior when I should have just walked away or should have been the bigger person? Absolutely. I've done that. And I probably have done that more recently than I would like to admit, but I do it far less than I used to. And I hope that one day I'll be mature enough to never do that again. But yes, absolutely. And if you think you have to be, to be a Christian, to earn heaven, that you've got to never get angry and never, do something that a few seconds, a few minutes, a day later you wish you hadn't done, you're in the wrong business, because there's plenty of examples throughout the Bible, and even particularly in the New Testament, of people that rashly did things that they wish they hadn't done. So absolutely. God, it's been said many times that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's probably we ought to listen twice as much as we talk. And it's clear that the tongue gets you in more trouble throughout the New Testament than any other organ in the body. Ask your friends to pray about it. Some people are real proud and they don't want to, quote, bother anybody else. And so when they have a crisis, the last thing they want to do is tell everybody about it. And I've been disappointed over the years from times when leaders in the church are having something and they say, I don't want to bother anybody, so don't tell them, but I've got this going on. And I'm like, but you've been teaching for years that you need to actually have your brothers and sisters pray about it, and yet when it happens to you, you don't want anybody to know about it? A secret? That's not, we can't teach one thing and do something else. You know what? I'm just noticed I'm over time. So last couple of points, pray about it yourself. Praise God when the one who can answer and solve the problem gives you the answer. Praise God for the answer he gives, and honor God, not yourself, when he gives the victory. Well, thank you very much.